Good morning, everyone. I'm Ellen Myers, the Programs and Communications Director for the Newton Free Library. Thank you for tuning in for LGBTQ Terminology 101. This program is part of Newton Celebrates Pride, a month-long celebration throughout our city that is being presented by a coalition of Newton city departments, Newton-based organizations, and individuals. And I have just posted a link to all of the library's Newton Celebrates Pride events in the chat if you are interested. I want to thank our program partners, the Ashland Public Library, the Carey Memorial Library in Lexington, and the Tewksbury Public Library. Very important piece of housekeeping for this program, so please pay attention. Please note, by attending this event, you agree to follow our code of conduct. We are committed to providing a harassment-free experience for everyone, regardless of gender, gender identity and expression, age, sexual orientation, ability or disability, race, ethnicity, religion, etc. Harassment in any form will not be tolerated in this forum. Anyone in violation of these rules will be removed from the program, and we appreciate your respect. I'd like to let you know that the Q&A is the vehicle for posing your questions. Please do not use the chat for questions that you wish to ask the speaker. Closed captioning, which I will be enabling shortly, will be enabled for this program, and you would be able to turn it off or back on by clicking on the live CC transcript icon at the bottom of your screen. And do note this program is being recorded. Our speaker will be giving her presentation for about 45 minutes, and then I will be facilitating the Q&A at the end with her. So remember to use that Q&A feature. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Emily Lunardi. She is a licensed mental health counselor and registered drama therapist specializing in LGBTQIA+ mental health. She is committed to empowering individuals and communities to be strong allies in an effort to make the world a safer and more supportive place for queer and trans people. And now I turn the screen over to you, Emily.
Thank you so much, Ellen. I really appreciate it. Hi, everybody. I know that I can't see you, but I'm very happy to have you here. I'm just going to share my screen here and get us started. Okay. So I just want to thank everyone who invited me to be part of this. I want to thank Ellen and Nina for including me in this tonight. I know that Ellen told you a little bit about me. I'm going to tell you a little bit about me as well. And I encourage you, as questions come up throughout this time, to use that Q&A function to ask questions. Because this is a webinar, it's a little less of a conversation than some other forums, but I hope for it to be in its own way where you can note your own thoughts and questions throughout, and we'll spend some time at the end where I hope to answer as many as I can. I'm also going to give you some of my information towards the end of this time so that you can reach out if you have other questions for me that you don't feel comfortable asking in this forum. So let's get started. Tonight, I'm going to tell you a little bit about me. We're going to talk about the current state of harm towards LGBTQ folks. And we're going to go over what I call my LGBTQ 101. We're going to talk about concepts. We're going to think about the idea of identity as a spectrum. We're going to go over common identities, talk about pronouns. Of course, I'll leave time for questions, and I'm also going to give you some resources. So my goal is for you to leave tonight with some solid, maybe new knowledge, deepened understanding of some things, and some resources to take with you. Okay. So about me, some of this you already know, but as Ellen said, I'm a licensed mental health counselor and registered drama therapist. I'm an LGBTQ competency educator and consultant for organizations and individuals. I'm also an outpatient therapist. I see a practice of teens and adults in my outpatient work, and I do specialize in LGBTQ mental health. I'm also a graduate professor at Lesley University, my alma mater, in their expressive arts therapies department. And I'm also part of the LGBTQ community myself. So, you know, while I can't speak to every experience by any means, my experience certainly informs the work that I do and is a big part of how I like to approach these conversations. Some things that I like to share as my commitments. I am constantly trying to improve my own queer competency, my commitment to anti-racism and allyship with oppressed groups. I'm always thinking about ways to make more connections with people who are trying to make real incredible change in their own worlds. I'm always trying to support the LGBTQ competency of my community, which is why I'm here today. And I'm always working to educate and empower people. I think that a lot of people come to conversations like this feeling like there's so many words, there's so many concepts and identities. How am I supposed to keep track of all of this? How am I supposed to understand what all of these words mean? And my hope is to make things a little bit less intimidating by going over it together and giving you some knowledge that you can use to support the people in your life who you really love and want to show up for. And of course, I'm committed to advocating for LGBTQ visibility, safety, and support. So with that, let's talk about a little bit of what's going on in the world in terms of queer needs. So I include this slide because while Pride Month is a time of joy and celebration, it's also a time of advocacy and of really an important fight for LGBTQ people. Unfortunately, the LGBTQ community is an oppressed population. There is some legal protections and social acceptance, but the truth is that LGBTQ people are at risk of harm, both interpersonally and legislatively. And in my work specifically in LGBTQ mental health, I do see this playing out in terms of LGBTQ people's well-being and overall way that they're able to function and thrive in their lives. And I say this as an LGBTQ person myself. So far in this year, 2023, in this country, there have been over 540 pieces of legislation introduced that are designed to either take away the rights or allow for the discrimination of LGBTQ people. Now, not all those pieces of legislation have been passed, but that there is statistics to say that whenever a piece of legislation is introduced, the mental health difficulties of LGBTQ people, specifically youth, spike, which is a real issue for people like me who work specifically with LGBTQ folks. Just about a week ago, the Human Rights Campaign declared a state of emergency for LGBTQ people in this country, citing the passage of over 75 laws in a dozen states that explicitly target this community. So that's not good news. And it makes things difficult for queer people to live their lives and feel like they're able to thrive and function. And the way that this plays out in mental health is that LGBTQ people are at increased risk of harassment, domestic violence, homelessness, mental illness, and addiction, to name a few. I don't say all of those things to dampen the mood. I know that these things are not fun to see or hear about or talk about, but I say it to provide some context, because what I really believe is that allyship starts with education, which is why we're here. We're here to learn some things and feel like we're in a good space, engaging with our advocacy and allyship. And I know that some people in this community who are here with me today are probably part of this community with me. So to all of you who feel impacted by this, I really stand with you and feel supportive and community with you in that. And if you have some loved ones who are part of this community who are struggling with this, I'm hoping that we can do some work tonight to feel like you know how to support them in the best way possible. So with that, let's start with the basics here. Let's do some LGBTQIA plus 101. So I always like to start with the idea of concepts. I think if we get into the nitty-gritty of the terms right away, it can make it hard to see the big picture. So I like to break things down into expression, identity, sex, gender, and sexuality. Now, by no means does this cover everything. There are certainly people who would do this training in a different way, and they're also right. But this is my perspective. This is the way that I see things. And the inconsistencies in how people might talk about this is a testament to the fact of how personal and nuanced these experiences are. So with that, let's look into this a little bit. Expression is how we present ourselves to others. It's how we show up in the world. I'm wearing my hair down. I have a yellow flowered top on tonight. I use the pronoun she, her, hers. I use the name Emily. All of those things are part of my expression, the way that I show myself to the world. Now, my expression is not the same thing as my identity. It might tell you something about my identity, but all 5 of these concepts are different. That is the baseline of what to understand here. Identity is who we know ourselves to be, and that includes so many things. It includes my gender, my sexuality, all of these pieces, but it also includes my interests, the things that I am drawn towards, the things that I'm not, all of those pieces. Our sex are biological characteristics, both internal and external. Our sex is really identified often by a doctor or people who are present at our birth who look at our body parts and say, it's a girl or it's a boy. Unfortunately, those people end up really being incorrect a fair amount of the time when somebody's gender then differs from their sex, and we'll talk about that. So gender and sex are different. This is a huge piece to understand here, specifically when we're thinking about our trans folks and everybody, really. Gender is how we understand and identify ourselves in relation to social constructs of masculinity and femininity. Our gender might align with our sex. For example, I was assigned female at birth and I do identify as female. Those things have aligned for me in my life, but that isn't the case for everybody. Our sexuality is how we identify with regards to our attraction to other people. So the way that we, at least that I was taught, that many people are taught, is that you're born, the doctor looks at your parts and says, it's a girl or it's a boy. You're going to agree with that for the rest of your life. And that inherently means that you'll be attracted to the opposite sex. But that just isn't how it works. People are so much more complicated and nuanced and beautifully complex than that. Our sex assigned at birth tells you what body parts the doctor saw. Your gender is how you feel with regards to these concepts, these social constructs of masculinity and femininity. Your sexuality is who you're attracted to. These things are all going to differ. Of course, your identity is bigger than that, and your expression is how we choose to show ourselves in these ways to the world. So the words we use are impacted by these things and how they interact with each other. For example, like I said, my sex assigned at birth is female, my gender is female, my sexuality, I identify as a lesbian because I'm attracted to women. Now, if my sex assigned at birth was male and my gender was male and I was attracted to women, there'd be a different word for that than lesbian. So the words and the terms are totally impacted by these concepts and how they interact with each other, which is why I like to start here. So next, what we're going to look at is the way that all of these things exist on a spectrum. We're going to try and challenge our tendency as humans to put things into boxes. We're going to spread it out a little bit. Okay, so all identities exist on spectrums, really more like complicated constellations, but a PowerPoint slide is only so big. So I gave some examples here of spectrums that we're looking at. Again, it's more complicated than what we can see here, but for the purposes of our conversation today, I really wanted to show us this. So we start with the spectrum of sexuality. On that one end, we have heterosexual. On the other end, we have homosexual. My guess is many of you are familiar with these words and what they mean. But the truth is that there aren't just two boxes. There's a whole big spectrum and people can be anywhere in between, right? So someone who's right in the middle of this might identify as bisexual. They might not. Somebody who is all the way towards heterosexual might identify as heterosexual, or they might see themselves a little more complicatedly than that. Somebody who's kind of like 70% towards homosexual might call themselves a homosexual. They might call themselves bisexual. They might identify as pansexual. These words we'll all talk about. So where a person is tells you a little bit about their attraction, but the words that they use still might differ. That's up to them. Then we have a spectrum of gender expression, from masculine to feminine. The way that we show up in the world, the clothes that we choose to put on, the way we dress ourselves, the way we present, the pronouns that we use, our interests, the things that we do, that we spend our time with, are all part of our expression of who we are. Gender can be included in that. But there aren't just two boxes of the ways people exist in the world. There are lots of ways. And this might differ day to day. There are days that I wear dresses. There are days that I wear pants. That doesn't change anything about who I am personally. It just changes how I'm showing myself to the world. That's where the spectrum exists. Then we have the spectrum of biological sex. This one I find to be a fairly new concept to a lot of people because, again, we're told you're either a girl or you're a boy. You're born and the doctor sees this part or the doctor sees that part. But really, again, we're just more complicated than that as people. Oftentimes, people have a combination of what we might call typically masculine or feminine genitalia or internal sex characteristics, external sex characteristics. We call these folks often intersex, which we'll talk about later as well. So although this might not always be visible externally at time of birth, there is a spectrum of the way people experience biological sex characteristics. The spectrum of gender identity I have here, man on one side, woman on the other, this by no means covers the way that gender identity exists in our world. There are people who are in the middle of these two extremes on the spectrum. There are people who don't identify on this spectrum at all of which are really valid ways of experiencing or not experiencing gender. Someone who's right in the middle might refer to themselves as non-binary. They might not. That's really up to them and how they understand themselves. Then I added a spectrum of sexual attraction. On one end, we have asexual, which you may hear people refer to as ace. Asexuality generally refers to a lack of interest in engaging in sex, a lack of sexual attraction or desire. That isn't the case for everybody. That doesn't mean that all asexual people never engage in sex. It's really dependent on that person, their relationship styles, and what they prefer. On the other end, we have allosexual, which is a very rarely used word. What it means is people who do experience sexual attraction. You may be all the way to one end on the spectrum, or you may be somewhere in between. Now, this doesn't refer to who you're attracted to, but the fact that you might be attracted to anyone at all. You may be a sexual person. Our sexuality is separate from who we're attracted to, right? We have our own sexual desires separate from who they're geared towards. So if you're looking at this and you're feeling really confused, I just want us to take a beat, take a breath. I understand that. What I hope that you take from this slide is that the world's really complicated, which means that our tendency, again, to try and put people into boxes makes things really even more difficult, because that's not how people work. We're just way more nuanced than that, which you're going to hear me keep saying, I'm sure. So I want you to take just a moment and look at this. And I want you to think about yourself, your own sexuality, gender expression, biological sex, gender identity, sexual attraction. Some of these things you may have spent a ton of time thinking about. Some of them you may have spent hardly ever thinking about. That's okay. Take a moment, just check in with yourself. If you were to put yourself on these spectrums, where would you be? Is that something you feel comfortable sharing with people? Is it not? That's okay. Take a moment. When we think about the idea of being closeted that many LGBTQ people experience, of not being out, right? That's because some placement of theirs on a spectrum like this, and we could put many more on this slide, is something that feels scary to share with other people for some reason, whether that's due to difficulty with safety or difficulty with feeling like they'll still have the same friends or the same kind of family support. That's why people hide these things. So if there's a part of you that looks at this and thinks, wow, I really don't want people to know that about me, maybe you can relate to that in just a small amount. So let's keep moving here. We're going to talk about some terminology. Now, there's a lot of words on this slide. Some of them you probably already know. Some of them you might not. So let's go through this together. Generally, a lesbian is a woman who's attracted to other women. That's me. I'm a lesbian. However, I don't really like the word lesbian. I tend to use the word gay. So I'm already breaking the rules, and that's okay. It's really up to the person and how they experience their identity and what words that they want to use. That being said, gay generally refers to a man who's attracted to other men. Bisexual refers to a person who's attracted to people of their own gender and of a different gender. Now, we used to say that bisexual was someone who was attracted to both genders, but we don't say that anymore because there aren't only two genders. There are lots and lots and lots of ways that people experience gender. So if we're to say that a bisexual person is attracted to both genders, we're inherently leaving some people out. So instead we use this definition or something like it. Pansexual is a word you may not be familiar with. It refers to a person who's attracted to others regardless of sex or gender. What a lot of folks who are pansexual will say is that they're attracted to hearts, not parts. The way a person's body is built doesn't necessarily mean that they're not or will be attracted to them. Now, a pansexual person's not attracted to everybody on the planet. It's just that the body parts a person has doesn't make or break whether or not they're attracted to them. Now, queer. I say this word knowing that there are probably some folks here who don't like that word. And I want to really acknowledge and respect that experience. What I find in my work is that folks who were alive and really aware of what was going on during the AIDS epidemic don't like this term, and older don't like this term. A lot of younger LGBTQ folks really do like this term and use it as an umbrella. I really like it personally. I even have some peers and friends my age in the millennial bracket who don't like this term. So I always try to respect how a person uses this. I never refer to a person as queer before they do themselves. Transgender is a word you may have heard. Transgender refers to a person who identifies with a gender other than the one they were assigned at birth. What that means is when they were born, the doctor said it's a girl or it's a boy, and it's somewhere along the line that stopped being true. The person's gender does not align with the sex they were assigned at birth. Now, cisgender refers to a person who does identify with the gender they were assigned at birth. I'm cisgender. Like I said, I was assigned female at birth, and I do identify that way. Now, non-binary, gender non-conforming, we could also put gender fluid, gender expansive here, refers to a person who really generally does not identify as male or female, or we could say just identifies with gender in a more expansive way beyond those two boxes or categories. Some people who are non-binary identify as trans, some don't. It's really up to them. Some people who are gender non-conforming, gender fluid, experience gender shifting and changing throughout their lives. Some people don't. They feel really solid in whatever gender identity they have. Agender, similarly to asexual, refers to a person who generally does not identify with a gender. It's just not an important part of how they experience themselves and their identity. If we think back to those 5 concept boxes earlier on, it might be that the gender box just doesn't really matter for them. That's totally okay. Now I'm going to move us on to the next words here. So intersex, we talked about this one already. Intersex refers to a person who generally is born with a combination of typically male and female traits, both internal and external. There are many, many, many different ways to be intersex. Some people who are intersex do identify as part of the LGBTQ community, and some don't. Some people who are intersex, it's acknowledgeable at time of birth that the person is intersex. And for some folks, it doesn't appear to be the case until puberty. It turns out that the person doesn't have the internal sex characteristics that was expected of them because of the stereotypes with their external genitalia or sex characteristics. What I've heard that I find really interesting is that intersex, the experience of being intersex is about as common as people with green eyes or with red hair. It's about 1 in 100. I've even seen stats that it's much higher rates than that. We're just, again, really a lot more complicated than just existing in only 2 boxes. So it makes sense to me that this experience is way more highly common than we might know or might be reported. We already learned these next words, asexual and allosexual. A person who does not experience sexual attraction and a person who does. Again, the way these people choose to engage in sexuality is up to them and their lives and where they live on that spectrum, right? Similarly, we have aromantic and alloromantic. Again, aromantic refers to a person who does not experience romantic attraction, while alloromantic refers to a person who does experience romantic attraction. You may hear people refer to themselves as ace or aro, or arrow, that's referring to these terms, asexuality and aromantic. Now, these next 2 can be identities or they might be relationship styles. We have polyamory, which is the practice of engaging in multiple romantic and or sexual relationships ethically. That means everyone knows about it. Everyone has agreed to some kind of contract of what is acceptable in that relationship and what feels comfortable for people. Like I said, can be an identity or relationship style. And monogamy is the practice of engaging in one romantic sexual relationship at a time, can be identity or a relationship style. Now, polyamory has taught a lot of folks that there are lots of ways to be in relationships with people. Some relationships are purely sexual, some are more romantic, some serve us in different ways beyond those 2 ways of engaging in relationships. But again, the important piece here is that it's ethical. You may also hear people refer to this as ethical non-monogamy or ENM. So this is becoming more and more acceptable and more talked about. And I think it's always important when meeting someone new and asking about their relationships to ask if they have any relationships, not just are you in a relationship. To make space for these experiences and how they might show up. So now we're going to talk a little bit about pronouns. I think pronouns is a place where some people feel like, I just don't know how to use that word. I just don't know how to refer to that person in that way. I want to start out by saying it is not rude to ask someone their pronouns. We want to start thinking about it like if we're asking someone their name. Hi, I'm Emily. My pronouns are she, her. What are your name and pronouns? Now, I understand that that's not how a lot of people communicate with each other, but both are very important when starting to understand how to refer to someone. Remember, when we talked about gender expression and gender identity and how they're different, that's going to be important here. So let's look at this together. Pronouns are used to substitute a proper noun. You probably already knew that. Using someone's correct pronouns, meaning the pronouns that they say are the ones that they use, is basic respect and makes them feel respected, safe, understood, and important. I I use she, her pronouns. If someone were to refer to me with he, him pronouns, I would know who they were talking about. And if they continue to do it over and over and over again, I would feel like they didn't really care about the way that I told them I live in the world. It's the same for trans folks, although the stakes are even higher because of the systemic power dynamic for trans people and the challenges that trans people face on a day-to-day basis. This is really important. Using incorrect pronouns for someone, using the pronouns that they don't want to use, is called misgendering. Misgendering becomes harassment or even abuse if done intentionally or continuously. Now, if you've misgendered someone before, which you probably have, whether you know it or not, that doesn't mean you harassed or abused them necessarily. I've certainly made mistakes like this. Sometimes our brains take a little bit to keep up or to catch up. When we misgender someone, if we do, it's really important that we apologize quickly and keep moving on. What we don't want to do is make it all about us, where we over apologize and say, oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. I know you use the pronouns they, them. I love trans people. Really, I do. I didn't mean to do it. I'm so terrible. Then we're putting the trans person in a position where they feel like they have to make us feel better. That is not fair, and it's not their job. We can manage our own feelings. We can say, I'm so sorry, and we keep talking. And then we take a deep breath and we hold the feelings that we have about it and we treat it as a learning experience. Remember, a person's pronouns do not signify their gender identity necessarily, but the pronouns can be a way that they express their gender. I use she, her pronouns. That is a way that I express my gender and who I am in the world. I haven't had to spend a lot of time thinking about that because those are the pronouns I've been referred to my whole life. But for a lot of folks, that is not the case. There tends to be a conception that for people who use they, them pronouns, they inherently must be non-binary or they must be trans. And I want to try and challenge that idea. Again, pronouns are a tool that we use to express ourselves and see how we're referred to in the world. It could relate to our gender identity, but they're not as glued together as we might think. That being said, some people who use she or he pronouns might not identify in that girl or boy, woman or man box as solidly as we might expect them to. We want to try and detach those ideas. Now, this next one can be tricky. If someone uses pronouns other than he or she, or if you're not sure how to refer to someone, I challenge you to avoid using gendered language, such as sir or ma'am. This one is tricky, especially for folks who were raised or who work in an industry where it's really expected and respect to engage with people in a way that uses sir or ma'am. And I want to acknowledge that and hold that sometimes that might be the right thing to do. However, if we don't know who a person is, we don't know how they experience their gender, or if we know that they don't identify as a sir or a ma'am, we don't want to use those words. That's also misgendering. And if someone expresses that they're uncomfortable with that, we really want to respect that. So a little more about pronouns. If someone uses pronouns you're unfamiliar with, you might need to practice them on your own. That's totally okay. I do that all the time. So I share with you here some ways to practice using pronouns. Writing a story about this person, I think, is a great idea. You can just jot down a note in your phone or write it on a piece of paper. For me, the story I use to practice new pronouns always has to do with going to the grocery store. I don't know why, but I'll practice myself. Okay, they're going to the grocery store to buy eggs and toast that they're going to use to make breakfast with their friends later today. It just works for me. It doesn't have to be what you use, but I encourage you to come up with a little story like that you can use to practice. And then speak it out loud to yourself. Get used to the way the words feel in your mouth. I know a lot of people will say, but they, them pronouns, I'm just not used to it. That's not how we speak about people. I think you might be more used to it than you think. For example, if I were talking to somebody who lived somewhere else and they called me and they said, oh my goodness, the craziest thing happened today. I was at the grocery store and someone just collapsed and had a medical emergency, which I know isn't the most fun example. Forgive me for that. I wouldn't say, oh my gosh, is he okay? Or, oh my gosh, is she okay? The person didn't tell me anything about the person's gender who collapsed in the grocery store. I'm going to say, oh my gosh, are they okay? We default to they, them pronouns way more than we think we do. So if someone is using they, them pronouns, I want you to trust yourself just for a minute that you might be more capable of using it than you think. I mentioned this one already, but correct yourself if you use the incorrect pronouns for someone, whether they are present or not. A person's correct pronouns are not only necessary when they're in the room, they're also important when they're not in the room. To my fellow therapists, I really encourage this. If you're talking about someone you're working with, even if they're not in the room, make sure you're using their correct pronouns. If you are a teacher or if you're a friend of someone, or regardless of how you know and work with queer and trans people, the pronouns are the pronouns, whether the person's in the room or not. The only exception to that is if you're speaking with someone to whom that person is not out as using whatever their pronouns are. For example, if I know someone who isn't out to a mutual friend, I'm going to try and not use pronouns with that mutual friend that would out the friend who's using new pronouns. Again, if we use the incorrect pronouns, we want to apologize and keep moving on without a profuse apology. I promise it's not needed. I promise it's not needed. It only makes things a little bit weird. You just keep it rolling. So I wanted to go over some pronoun practice here. Starting with they, them, theirs. This might be the one that you're most familiar with beyond he or she. So I have here, they went to class. I have a card for them. This backpack is theirs. Now, this middle one here is an example of someone who uses two sets of pronouns. Now, a lot of people use combinations of pronouns. She, they, he, they. You might hear people say my pronouns are she, they. This means that they use both she, her, hers, and they, them, theirs pronouns. What I want to challenge you to do is not use the one you're most comfortable with, but try and use both. For whatever reason, that person doesn't feel like only one of those sets of pronouns fully encompasses their identity. So we want to try and use these pronouns interchangeably. Doesn't need to be perfect, doesn't need to be every other, but we want to use both. We don't get to just pick one. So she told me their test was very hard. They're having an issue with her roommate. They made the call. I'll give her a call back. It might take a bit to figure out who everybody's talking about. That's okay. You can ask. Are you talking about that one person? Yeah. Oh yeah. My friend uses she, they pronouns. Great. Now we all got it. This third one here is an example of what's called a neopronoun. A neopronoun meaning it's a word that was created to refer to a person who doesn't feel like he, she, or they encompasses who they are. There are hundreds of neopronouns. I don't even think that this is the most common one, but we're going to look at it together. This is pronounced sie, them, zir, and we use it exactly as it says. Z told me what happened. I need to speak with them. Zir friend is having a party. This is especially going to take some practice. My guess is the first time that you're told someone uses sie, them, zir pronouns is going to feel new. So go back to what we talked about already. Create a little story for yourself. Start to practice it so that the next time you talk about this person, you're really prepared to refer to them correctly. Okay. So now we come to the point of thoughts and questions. We got to here a little quicker than I expected, which is okay. I hope I wasn't talking too fast, but we're going to take a beat and I want to look over to the Q&A and see what we have here. So Ellen, are you there with us? Do you want to share some questions that you noticed from the Q&A?
Thank you.
Hi,
Thank you so much
great.
for a very informative program.
Oh, of course, happy to help.
So I want to start out with a question about fluidity over a lifetime. Can people's identities and expressions change over their lifetimes?
Absolutely. I think this idea that we have one identity and one way of being that we're going to be for the rest of our lives is actually kind of limiting. I don't want to live in a world that says I can only be one thing for the rest of my life. I'd still be pretty embarrassed by acting how I did when I was 15. Thank goodness I've been able to change and evolve in so many ways. And our gender and our sexuality, our gender expression is the same. Sometimes our gender identity changes or our sexuality changes, our pronouns, our expression changes because we learn more about ourselves, because we suddenly realize that we're really into this kind of clothing instead of that kind of clothing, because we meet someone who uses they, them pronouns and we think, oh my gosh, I'd really like to try that. Sometimes it changes because for a time in our lives, using they, them pronouns really fit, and it no longer fits. We can compare this to something like a professional interest or a relationship. Not every relationship lasts for the rest of our lives. It serves a purpose for a time, but we change and we evolve. So generally, yes, fluidity is the idea that we're just not as concrete or as set in stone as we think we are. I personally actually really see that as a beautiful thing that allows for so much transformation and evolution. I'm a little biased because I'm a therapist. I really appreciate personal growth, but I encourage you to try and think of it that way as well.
Thank you, Emily. And we have
Yeah,
another
of course.
question. How could we support a child whose parents are not supportive of their gender identity?
This is a really good question. Well, it depends what your relationship is to that kid and what your relationship is to those parents and how the parents are not being supportive. Um, LGBTQ youth mental health is actually one of the most researched areas of LGBTQ wellness. So there's a lot out there that tells you what the risks are for a trans youth or a queer youth not being supported, excuse me. One of my favorite pieces of research that I've ever seen is that a young person, a young queer person's risks of harming themselves are like 40% decreased by 40% if they have one adult in their lives who respects them and who uses their preferred name and pronouns. Now, that is a huge deal because it's not that hard to be that one adult in a kid's life, whether you're their neighbor, you're their cousin, you're their teacher, whatever it is. If you really make space to listen to them, to respect them, to educate yourself if they're telling you something you haven't heard before, to use the name and pronouns they're asking, you can make a giant impact in that kid's well-being, mental health, and future. Now, obviously, that doesn't fix the issue with the parents. And I want to really hold the fact that that's super, super challenging. For some of my queer and trans youth that I have worked with in my career, I can say that a big part of it is helping them see the big picture. This isn't forever. What's the countdown until you're 18? What's the countdown that you can go see the doctor who you want to see, or that you can connect with the person you want, or you can try and move out? And also, what are the ways we can get you support now? The internet is an awesome resource. It also can be terrible, but it's an awesome resource a lot of the time because a lot of teenagers have access to the whole internet on their phones. How can you connect with resources? What cool queer Instagrammer can you follow so you feel like you are connected to someone out there? So finding ways to connect kids to resources outside of the home is really important. And if you are knowledgeable about some of this stuff and these parents will listen to you, take over, change a life, educate some people, make the parents, or try to educate the parents about why what they're doing is harmful and how they could actually have a giant impact in their kid's life. In my experience, most parents who are having a hard time with this, it has nothing to do with the kid. It has everything to do with their own worldview. And they're often really afraid that they're not going to be able to connect with their kid because their kid is so different than what they expected. So helping the parent understand that, yeah, the kid might be different than how you expected them to be, but allowing yourself to be open to this world of theirs is going to allow for more connection, actually, and more safety and health for the kid. So I'm sorry that that's going on. And I encourage you to use this knowledge and try and help out in whatever way you can.
Thank you for being so encouraging, Emily. And we have another question. I think from what I'm reading in the Q&A, I see some people feel that a lot of information was put forward very quickly. And for those of us, particularly, I might speak for myself in my generation, not trying to represent everyone in my generation, I can see where they're coming from. So this person asks, is it polite to ask what pronouns she, he, they prefer? Is it appreciated? And then they comment that it requires them to have increased awareness. So that's, I think, a good sign.
It requires the person you're asking to have increased awareness. I think that is true, but
asking.
the person who's asking, yeah, that's true too.
Have increased awareness.
It is not rude to ask someone their pronouns. That being said, not everyone's used to being asked their pronouns. So some person might be asked their pronouns and think, what do you mean? Unfortunately, some people might be asked their pronouns and think, what do you mean? Do you think I'm trans? Do you think I'm gay? Right? And that really speaks to a lack of understanding about these concepts. But if you're getting to know someone new, especially if you know that this person identifies as part of the LGBTQ community, it is really respectful to ask, what pronouns do you use? I would stray away from asking, do you use she, her? Do you use he, him? Do you use they, them pronouns directly? And instead asking more broadly, what pronouns do you use? I also encourage you to start by sharing your own pronouns. Even as cisgender people, if we are able to share our pronouns, that creates a world where more people are comfortable and feel like there's just an acceptance and an understanding that people's pronouns matter. So if I'm meeting someone new, or if I'm introducing myself to someone via email, I'm going to share my pronouns. I also have my pronouns in my email signature. I have it in my Instagram bio. I have it on my website. I had it on the front page of this slide. I put it everywhere that I can so that it sets the tone. We share pronouns here. That's totally okay, right? So if you're getting to meet someone new, you might say, "Hi, I'm Emily. My pronouns are she, her. What are your name and pronouns?" And if you're the one to share first, that sets the tone of we share pronouns here, and that's totally okay. So no, it is not rude to ask pronouns. Yes, it's polite to ask pronouns. If it's received well, really depends on the context, the person you're asking. And if a person says, what is a pronoun? Then maybe that isn't something that's super important to that person. Something I do want to name is that not everyone's going to be comfortable to share their pronouns. If we think about it, a person who is trans or non-binary, who's experimenting with new pronouns, might not want to share their pronouns with you. They might not feel ready to come out in that moment, essentially. So if you ask someone their pronouns and they don't answer, don't push it. Leave it be. Leave it be. And if you don't remember what a person's pronouns are, or you're worried about using them, stick with the name. The name is always safest. If you know their name and you know it's a name that they use, you can say Emily a million times, as many times as you need, if you're not sure which pronouns I use. I hope that was helpful. And if there's anything specifically you'd like me to go back to, I know there's a bunch of questions, but I'm happy to go back a few slides and show you something again as well.
I mean, I'm just compelled to ask again. I'm a baby boomer, and I will say that when I was being raised in the part of this country that I was being raised in the state of Massachusetts, we were not talking about any of this. And I have friends who ultimately now, from let's say back in high school, who ultimately now I know are queer. And you know, it's hard for me to formulate this question, but it seems like over the last several years, a lot of this new language and etiquette to be inclusive and of and sensitive to LGBTQIA folks has come to the forefront. So where was all of this 20, 30, 40, 10 years ago?
It's such a good question. I really appreciate you asking that, Ellen. This stuff has always been around, actually. You know, there's record of queerness and transness in Indigenous populations all over the world. This is not new. Unfortunately, it has been pushed to the side and kind of exiled by a lot of powers that be throughout the years of civilization. But the concepts, the ways of being are not new. What's happening right now is that, at least in this country, and I can't speak to everywhere in the world, but in a lot of places, there is kind of a revolution of like, this is who I am. This is who I've always been. And I'm going to use a word to tell you about it. How liberating that is to have an experience that can be named. And for anyone who has ever felt really validated by anything they were afraid to share, I think you can relate to that piece of, oh my goodness, finally there's a word for this, which means one, there are other people on this planet who experience this because there's a word for it. And two, I can claim this. I can say, this is who I am. See me, understand me. So all of the words can feel so overwhelming and complicated, but they are just representations of more and more and more people saying, hello, this is me. This is who I am. I hope that you'll see me in the fullness of myself. But the experiences of being gay or bi or pan or trans or polyamorous or intersex or any of these words that we've named are not new. They're just very, very, very human experiences that unfortunately haven't had their moment in the sun for a lot of parts of our history.
In this country specifically.
Yeah.
Yeah, Emily, a couple people have asked, will you be sharing your slides?
Will I be sharing my slides?
In other words, will you be willing to, for example, send one of myself or Mina, our program partner, from the Ashland Public Library a link to your slides?
That's a good question. I am at the end of this, I'm gonna share my contact information, which is where people can reach out to me for anything that they want, in which case I'd be happy to send some of this, and you and I can chat after to see if there's a way that I can share slides to make it more accessible to people. I would love to make this as accessible as I possibly can. So generally, yes. Let Ellen and I chat afterwards so we can figure out the nitty gritty of that.
And we
I would love,
understand this proprietary nature to your slides, so we want.
yeah, but I'd love to make it more accessible too. So a tentative yes, and let's chat about how to make that possible.
Okay, so do you know about how to support LGBTQIA folks in Uganda?
Uganda. I don't know very much about Uganda or much experience about Uganda. I know that you know, the acceptance of queer folks in Uganda and in a lot of places are very very difficult right now. I would suggest looking into some national and international organizations who are doing this work, and I'm going to share some resources at the end that might be helpful in that regard. I think what we can do locally, if you don't live in Uganda and if you don't have connections to people in Uganda, is talking to people in your life here about these things and trying to impact your world and environment in the space that you have access to. What I always tell folks who I work with in whatever aspect is we do the best we can with the resources we have access to. We can't change the whole world individually, but we can educate our neighbors and our friends and our peers and our high school Facebook friends and all of these things, right? So that's where I encourage people to start, and then also thinking about places to get involved in larger organizations too.
Thank you, Emily.
Yeah.
And are there any ways that we can work towards pushing back against all the recent anti-LGBTQIA legislation?
Yeah, well, I think there's a lot of ways to do that. Sometimes people take to calling legislators, sending letters, sending emails, making clear if you're a constituent of that place that you're not happy, you're not comfortable, you're not in support of what your legislator who you hired and you pay to do their job is doing, that you're not happy with it. Another thing that's really important is to try and support people again in your community. If there are LGBTQ people or youth or adults, whoever that you know in your world who are being impacted by this legislation, checking in on them, asking them how they are, finding if there's ways that you can donate to an LGBTQ youth organization or some grassroots organizations who are trying to challenge these laws, supporting candidates who might run for office, who might have perspectives that you really agree with, getting involved in a way that feels accessible to you, whether it's financially or emotionally or time-wise, whatever's possible is always really appreciated. But the most important thing is to make your voice heard if you're not okay with it. And I am grateful that you're not, but if you're not, talk about it. There's no need to be quiet. Nobody's asking you to be quiet. Please, we love it. We want your voice. We want as much support as we can. And that's actually what it means to be an ally, to stand up and spend a moment really putting yourself in a position to advocate for people who are struggling.
I mean, I would also say that showing up at an event like this to try to educate oneself and then being able to openly share via the chat that perhaps you don't understand everything all at once because there's so much new information coming at you is a great marker for people being open and curious and actually wanting to learn. And then as you learn more, you become more supportive.
Yes, totally. You're all doing great by being here right now. If you're here, you're doing awesome. I consider you an ally, and I'm grateful to have you here as part of the community, or maybe you're part of the community yourself. I know that there's so many words, and it's normal at this point of the presentation to be like, whoa, 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 what was that word? What was that concept? I think somebody said that thing, but I don't remember what it means. And now I'm afraid and I'm not going to say any words. And I really want to challenge that idea. The most important thing you take from this is not a memorization of a glossary. There's no quiz here. The most important thing is to feel like, oh, people are complicated. This is normal. I can be an ally by sharing my pronouns in my email signature at work. I can show up for my grandkid in this way. I can make sure that I challenge my neighbor who has some views that I don't agree with and tell them how that's harming people, like we talked about earlier on. That's what's most important. And the words are going to change. If I were to do this in 3 years, there'd be new words and I'd be outdated. Maybe I already am. So don't stress too much about the word.
Right, so actually there is a question that says, I thought she, they pronouns meant that they're comfortable with using either pronouns rather than both. Or maybe I could ask. So, I,
It's a great
let's
question.
visit that.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I'm going to repeat that question for folks who may not have caught it. I had said earlier that if someone uses she, they pronouns, that means that they use both interchangeably, and we don't get to pick which one we want to use for them. But this question is saying, well, what if a person says, I use she or they? It doesn't have to be both. I'm okay with either. In a way that's pretty similar, but a person's experience of it might be like, today I'm really using they. Today I'm really using she. I really want both today. Actually, they, them every once in a while, but she most of the time. Asking. Hey, you use she, they pronouns. Can you tell me a little bit about what you would prefer for me? Do you want me to use both? Do you want me to use one? Do you want one more than the other? What do you prefer? They might have an answer for you, they might not. But there's never going to be a slide I can show you that tells you what one specific person wants in regards to their she, they pronouns. You'll just have to ask them. And that's totally okay. Hey, I went to a presentation. Somebody was talking about she, they pronouns, and it seems different than your experience. Can you clarify how you want me to refer to you? In a way, that's the same as like, hey, I thought your name was Emily, but I think somebody else said it's Erica. So what's your name again? It's kind of the same thing. We just want to know how to refer to people correctly.
Although I feel
according
that
to them.
it could be somewhat challenging and confusing for people who are, and I include myself in this group, for people who are beginning to learn this terminology.
Yeah.
The idea that someone might want to use she one day and they another day. So if yesterday your colleague at work was using she pronouns and today they're not feeling it, they're feeling they, is it the responsibility of the person who who is working with this individual to ask every single day, what pronouns are you using?
No, not
That
necessarily.
seems burdensome and inappropriate.
Yeah. It could be intrusive too. And it's, nobody needs to be a mind reader here. That's not the goal, right? But if you know that someone has been using she pronouns for however long, and you refer to them as she, or you refer to that person as she, and the person goes, oh, I'm using they, them pronouns now. Your job is not to say, okay, great. I'll then ask you every day forever. So I make sure I get it right. But instead say, oh, great. Thanks for telling me. I'm going to refer to you with they, them pronouns now. That's it. And if a little later they say, actually, I'm using she and they, you can interchange it, then go in with that, right? The core of this is honoring who people tell us that they are, because it's not up to us to decide. And therefore, it's also not our responsibility to figure it out. It's their world. And if they choose to share with us something about how they want to be referred to or how they exist in the world, our only job is to respect that. And that goes along with using the pronouns if a person wants specific pronouns. We don't have to be emailing everyone we know every morning at 8 a.m. to say, what are everybody's pronouns today? I don't want to mess it up, right? Our job is just to respect the information as it's shared with us.
Thank you for clarifying.
Of course.
And
yeah.
another point of clarification, what does the IA mean in LGBTQIA?
Great question. Yeah, I think that's important. So really, I could put it like 100 letters. There are so many letters, as you know, from all the words that we went over that didn't even cover it all. I tend to use LGBTQIA. Some people use LGBT, some people use LGBTQ. This is what I use. Lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans. Queer is for Q. Sometimes questioning is for Q. Either is fine with me. The I is for intersex. And the A is for asexual or aromantic. Some people also add a P for pansexual. At some point, it becomes a lot of letters, which is why I then switched to queer as an umbrella term. But I if I'm working with an organization, I tend to use whatever combination of letters they use. But that's what the I and the A stands for, is intersex and asexual or aromantic.
And can you talk a little bit more about what the CIS means in cisgender?
Yes. So cisgender, I don't know the origin of that beginning of that word there, but cisgender as a word refers to someone who experiences the gender that aligns with the sex they were assigned at birth. which means that they're not transgender. Cisgender and transgender, we can think of them as opposites, really generally, right? So a person who's trans, their gender identity that they use and understand and experience as they move through the world is not how they were raised necessarily. It's not what they were assigned at birth. It's not how they were referred to as in the very beginning of their life. They've learned more and identify differently. A cisgender person, CIS gender, the gender they were assigned at birth aligns with their sex at birth and aligns with how they feel about themselves going throughout their life. Of course, things can always change. We're complicated people, but that's what cisgender means.
Well, let me take this one last question, and then I believe you said
Sure.
you want to share some resources. So
Yes, I can.
I think this is a very important question. Are there any recommended bibliotherapy podcast resources for educating LGBTQIA plus youth?
That's a great question. Some resources. So there's, if you go to a website that I haven't been to in a while, so fair warning, mykidisgay.com. It's geared towards supporting parents whose kids are coming out. I believe that's the link, mykidisgay.com. There's also a podcast that I used to listen to that I also haven't listened to in a while called Gender Reveal, which is kind of a play on the gender reveals people do for babies. And it is a podcast run by a trans person who's always interviewing trans people about their experiences. I can't speak to how PG or not it is, so maybe listen to it without kids at first. I haven't listened in a long time. But that's a great way to just get to know a little bit more about this stuff. There's some great documentaries out there. There's some great books out there. There's so many books in your libraries, at all these libraries, that are written by trans people about their own experiences. I highly, highly, highly encourage you to read one. I can't recommend one because they're all great. I've read a lot of them, but I encourage you to pick one up and read it or listen to it, whatever, so that you can start to hear the experiences of individuals who live lives that are different than yours. But about educating kids specifically, I'm going to share some resources about community organizations that are great for that. But sometimes it starts with educating yourself and then educating kids.
Mm. So I think we've come to the end of the Q&A portion, Emily, and I really want to thank you for this very open and honest conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I'm going to share some resources here. This is both for LGBTQ folks and their loved ones. So some national resources are the Trevor Project, Trans Lifeline, and Human Rights Campaign. If you are looking for a way to support queer youth financially, these are some great organizations, some great organizations nationally. The Trevor Project and Trans Lifeline are both, or the Trans Lifeline definitely is an emergency lifeline that trans youth can call or text if they're feeling unsafe. And the Trevor Project is also geared towards supporting queer youth. And they do a lot of really great research about queer youth mental health. The Human Rights Campaign is, I think most people are familiar with it, but it's a national organization that's geared towards supporting the rights of all, politically and financially and all of these things. Local resources, so safety, I really think they're great. They're a local LGBTQ mental health organization based out of Brookline. Fenway Health is a physical and mental health organization that I think a lot of people are probably familiar with in Boston. They do a lot of great research as well about queer folks. Boston Glass is run through JRI, and they are an organization that supports health and well-being and housing for LGBTQ youth. Unfortunately, the homeless rate for LGBTQ youth is incredibly high. Most homeless youth are LGBTQ. So this is a great organization that supports and gives resources for unhoused queer youth and young people. And Greater Boston PFLAG is a great resource, not only for queer youth, but also families of queer youth. They have events, they have, in social media accounts you can follow, places to donate. And then Out Metro West is also a great organization for queer youth that's focused on, activities and clubs and resources. A lot of these can connect you with mental health professionals if you have questions, but I would encourage you to take a moment and maybe jot some of these down for sure.
Well, this has been a very educational evening, Emily. I want to
thank you.
Our partnering.
And
go ahead.
I was just going to share too, I can share my email in a moment. once I give another second for people to jot this down. So if you have any other questions, I know that this isn't always a forum where people feel safe or comfortable asking questions. So please feel free to reach out to me. I can share that now. If you have more questions, if you want to share your thoughts, if you want to connect about some of my services, or if you just want to chat about ways that I can support you, I'm really committed to trying to support my community in whatever way that I can. And I just wanted to share this, that you can reach out. Be happy to chat more.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you very
you.
much. And thank you to our partnering organizations, our partnering libraries, the Ashland Public Library, the Carey Memorial Library in Lexington, and the Tewksbury Public Library. And just so you know, there will be a link sent to those who registered for this program to the recording that you are free to watch and share. And with that, I want to say thank you, and I'll close out the webinar.
Thank you, everyone.
Good night.